Yeah, we're live. It is 6:54, a full 6 minutes early. Very cool for all the people that already showed up. Hi, you, Exmo, Austin, Dodgy, and Dodgy, double dodgy. Today we're going to talk about something I'm working on right now. I'm doing the editing on, and it is to actually as a, let's say, second test from the video that I posted today, which was a comparison between the Vortec centrifugal supercharger and the twin turbos run on the 4.6 two-valve motor, which is very cool. And the cool thing is that all of that testing was done very early on. That was one of my first series of tests that we ran with the 4.6 two-valve, and we ran a bunch of stuff. We ran nitrous on it and different cams and ported heads and things. And then we're lucky enough that the guys from Vortec supplied one of the kits. And what I didn't put in that video, also, we ran a Kenny Bell twin screw supercharger on that, as well. And it worked out very well, as you would expect. And that's the great thing about boost. And I've said that over and over again. It's much better to have a boosted motor than a naturally aspirated motor. All of the guys that like all motor stuff are guys that haven't tried boosted stuff, because everything that the all motor stuff does, the boosted stuff also does more than that. So that's why I like turbo stuff so much, but and supercharged stuff and all the different superchargers. But we ran the Vortec and kind of compared it, although not on the same motor, to the twin turbo setup from the guys at HP Performance that we ran. And it goes to show you the same thing. If you take a look at the video they have up on the 4-valve combination, where I did run all the forms of force induction on the same motor. So yes, I have done apples to apples tests as well, where we ran them all at the same boost, same air fuel, same timing. And not only that, I did it at multiple boost levels for all the different forms. The problem was in that 4-valve test, we run into a problem with the flow rate, basically, of the root supercharger. Now, Kenny Bell had blowers that were big enough to support the upper power levels. The turbos were capable of supporting the upper power levels. The Paxton or Vortec was capable of supporting the upper power levels. But the factory supercharger, the 112 on the 03, on that particular 03 Cobra, just was not big enough to support the higher power levels in the 700, 800, 900 horsepower range where we ran the boost up. So it was kind of ill-suited to that, and it would have been better to have maybe a Magnuson or something like that. But because it was an 03 Cobra motor, we used the 03 Cobra blower to use the comparison, and it worked very well. And then running the Vortec on the, which started out as a 98 4.6 liter 2-valve, and then we put PI heads on it and cams and an intake manifold, and then ran it with the Vortec. And the Vortec worked out very well. And one of the interesting things that I pointed out in that video is that the supercharger or the intercooler for the supercharger kit, the core that they used on that Vortec, was actually slightly on the small side, because we were easily able to exceed 600 horsepower. I think it made 625 or something, and not at very much boost. But that core, that intercooler core, was actually getting fairly restrictive. We know because when I ran a test long after that with a 351 Windsor, I think with the Edelbrock stuff on there, and we ran it with a centrifugal blower on it, and we ran it with that core, that same core that they use on the 5-liter stuff, because that's what I used, was basically a 5-liter Ford kit with that intercooler core. And then we took that core off, and I put the big core that I run from CX Racing on it, and it picked up a lot of power. And the charge temperature was a little bit lower. The boost was higher in the manifold, which shows that there was obviously restriction in the other core. And it works well for, if you think about it, back in the day, not many people were driving around with 600 horsepower 5-liters. My Vortec supercharged 302 or 306 that I ran back in the day was lucky to make 430 or so at the tire, and that went very fast. So there were not a lot of guys until later on running 600 horsepower stuff. If you had a 600 horsepower Vortec deal, you had an R trim or a later S trim or T trim later on after that. But that core was a little bit small. So we know even on that 2-valve that it was getting to the point where we could have used a better core. On the twin turbo setup, the 246 millimeter turbos, and I keep saying that because they're 46 millimeter hole set turbos, and that's really the only information that I have on them. This test was run so long ago from the guys at HP Performance. And then they had 57. I take that back. I don't think that those were hole sets. I actually think that those were Garrett's. And then they also had 57 millimeter upgrades for those, which we ended up running on the 4-valve motor. And while I would love to have all of the specifics on the turbos, which is, more information is always better. So there are guys out there that want the inducer side and the exducer side on the compressor side and the inducer and exducer sides on the turbine. They want the ARs on both the compressor housing and on the turbine housing. And all of that's really good information. And I wish that on all of the tests that I had all of that information, but I don't always have that. And in my defense a little bit, in this particular test, we weren't testing that. We weren't testing those two particular turbos where we would need specifics on them compared to that particular Vortec. This is more, and as a matter of fact, they don't even run on the same test motor. So this was more of a generic look at what happens when you put a centrifugal blower and what kind of power curve does it provide versus turbos that are sized correctly for this application, and what kind of boost curve and power curve does it provide? Because in this instance, on the 2-valve test, both the Vortec and the turbos were able to supply more than enough power for the levels that we were at. They had more than enough flow capability. They could go beyond where we were, so that wasn't a problem. I just wanted to show. A lot of guys don't understand. They think, oh, blowers have immediate boost response. Kind of. A centrifugal, when you get in the throttle immediately, it will show boost. It just shows very, very little. Like at 2,000 RPM, you might have 1 pound. You might not even have 1 full pound, but if you have 1 pound, what they're thinking of is more of a positive displacement supercharger of big capacity or higher speed, because that's the other way that you get more flow is if you spin the blower faster. And that's exactly what we did on the video that I'm working on right now. Is a 383 small block Chevy where we ran a Tech-Torqstorm centrifugal supercharger as a blow-through carbureted application, and also a 671 roots blower, which in retrospect, it'll be a good video because I like the results that came out of it. But really, when you think about it, nobody is, or I can't say nobody, very few people are going, okay, I need to look at all the data comparing a 671 roots blower. I need to know how efficient it is, how mechanically efficient, how thermally efficient, what's the discharge temperature at every given boost level, and how does that compare to a centrifugal supercharger? How's the boost response? How's the average torque production? Nobody does that. Almost nobody does that. A guy that wants a twin carbureted roots blower sticking out the hood is a different guy than a guy that wants a blow-through centrifugal supercharger. And I would make a further point that a guy that wants a Tech-Torqstorm supercharger, which is fairly limited in its power ability, it's like a 700 or 750 horsepower blower. In that way, it's kind of like the GT45 turbo that we use all the time. So it will do that. And I get questions all the time. The guys have Tech-Torqstorms. Oh, hey, what cam should I use? What head should I use? I want to go up in power. And I'm like, well, you're almost there. I mean, you have an LS, for instance. You have an LS3 with a cam in it, and you have that blower on there, and you're already almost maxing out the blower. So it's just not going to do much more with more things that you put on it. What you really need, if you want to make a lot more power, is you just need a bigger blower or two of those Tech-Torqstorms, which they have twin kits for them. So the small block Chevy is an interesting comparison because it's a big roots blower. And the cool thing about the roots blower is that we ran it at different boost levels. We ran it like 8 and 10 and 11 and a half. And then we ran it on a mixture of pump gas and race gas so that we could put enough timing in. I think we ran almost 30 degrees on that supercharged combination. It had aluminum heads. It was 9-to-1. It had a decent cam in it, a 224, 236 kind of thing. But we also ran it with the E85. And the cool thing about the E85, and I'll go over that in the video, is that when we ran it, we just kept the same carburetors on there. We didn't run E85 carburetors. Now, these weren't blow-through carburetors. They were just draw-through carburetors. I think that these two were out-of-the-box 750 supercharger carburetors from Holley, and they worked fantastic. We put them on, and they were right out of the box. And if I remember right, I think the jetting was 75 or 76 or something, the way that they came, and it worked great with dual 750s on it. Made plenty of power. And what we did was, in order to run the E85, we just put big jets in it. We basically put 99s on all four corners so that we could get enough fuel and get roughly the same air fuel on the gas scale. So you E85 guys, just relax. I'm not saying that we leaned it way out by running it at 11.5 to 1. This is 11.5 to 1 on the gas scale. So it had the right amount of fuel because we just kept putting jet in it. Basically, we put a bunch of jet in it, and it worked out fine. Because obviously the E85 requires a great deal more fuel flow to get the same relative air-fuel ratio. So that all worked out good. So when we put E85 in it, as I have done in the past, like on the LS and big blocks and stuff, when you run E85 on a root supercharger, it loves it. Because of all of the superchargers, that one needs the cooling. The nice thing about an E85 is it has the carburetors feeding fuel on the top of it. So that acts as charge cooling, just in the same way that a carburetor does on an intake manifold. If you measure the charge temperature of the manifold, it can be lower than ambient. And so there's lots of charge cooling provided by the fuel, and there's even more charge cooling provided by the E85 running through the 671. Plus, you have all that cool immediate boost response, and you have the whole, the visual appeal and the sound and all of that stuff. So it was kind of a cool deal. And so I'm looking forward to finishing up. I have all of the video done. I'm just doing the editing right now. And then I'm hoping to get that up tonight so that we can, keep all these videos going, which is awesome. So let's see what you guys are doing today and see what's going on, see what you guys have to say about all of this testing. I'm going to scroll back a little bit. Speaking of the RPM Act, I think it would be cool to have a discussion on that here. That would be good. I'd actually like to talk to somebody that knows a lot more about it, like maybe Chris Douglas from Comp Cams, or one of those guys would be good. George wants to know, I would love for someone to just tell me which one to buy for the L76 twin turbo setup. So George, tell me what you're trying to do, and we'll tell you what turbos that you need. So George, Karen's recommending 6266s. Cars are so fast these days. For me in high school, 400 wheel horsepower was a fast car. My Mustang only made like 430 or 40 with the blower on it at the tire, and it was really fast. 1,000 wheel horsepower cars with top dogs. Totally different now. I wonder if anyone's ever done a blow-through 671 setup. It would look ridiculous, but there are some weird people out there. Yeah, it could be. You could take turbos and blow through the top of the 671. It'd be a lot like we did with blowing through the M90, only without the complexity of the carburetors. Centrifugal has NA behavior and response, which is awesome, and it doesn't create too much torque and the wheel spin at lower speed. Much more controllable to accelerate and doesn't fall over the nose. Okay. I wish you strapped a Tech-Torqstorm to a stock 454 and tested it. I have run a Tech-Torqstorm on a big block, and I have to look up the data. I don't think it was stock, though. But like I said, the Tech-Torqstorm is a 700 to 750 horsepower supercharger. So it's probably not going to make that like a stock 454 when we run a stock Gen 6 454 from the wrecking yard, whether we run it fuel injected, which we've done, or just with a dual plane carburetor and distributor and stuff. It's about a 370 horsepower or so motor. A little bit less with the fuel injection. And then if we add a blower to that, it's probably going to be, 550 or 600, depending on how high we spin it and how much boost we're running. If you own an electric drill, you can have jets as big as you want. We've drilled out jets before. Then you start getting into needing needle and seat changes as well. Killer chillers. Is that where it's cooling the air before the carburetor or before the blower or something? I think I talked to somebody about that. Taj is pulling a 4-cylinder out of a 98 Ombre for a 383 swap. Nice. Richard, did you see Eric Weingartner's video he posted last night asking if you could do an intake test for him? Yeah, I spoke with him today. John's here live. Good to see you. Yes, we mentioned the request for Eric. Ever dyno tested engines with different valve springs? I'm glad you reminded me. I have a valve spring video that I'm doing. Let's see. I've heard stiffer valve springs are worth more power rather than adequate valve springs. No. Stiffer valve springs are worth more power if you run into valve float or valve instability. Then if it cures that, then you see more power. It's not really the spring that's doing that. It's just now the rollers are actually, or lifters are actually following the camshaft. So the valve is doing what it's supposed to, what the cam is requesting for it to do relative to the RPM of the engine and stuff, and the piston position. So if valve springs can cure that, but the question now is, do stiffer valve springs cost power? Do you think a Torque-Storm would work on a VQ40 out of a Frontier? The Torque-Storm will work on any motor. We ran a Torque-Storm on a 4.3 liter V6 because it's the same mounting pattern as a small block Chevy, so it bolted right on. You can bolt a Torque-Storm to anything. I've run it on a small block Ford, a 302, a 351. We ran it on a Hemi. We ran it on a small block. We ran it on a V6. I'm thinking that I ran it on something else as well. We ran on the 305 small block Chevy, ran on the 350. I might have run a single on the big block. I know that we were trying to run the twins on a big block. Evening, Rich. Thoughts on today's carb to EFI for old school 65 Mustang 289-306? That isn't too complicated. Vern, I actually wouldn't replace the carburetor with the throttle body EFI. Unless you're driving long distances where you can dial in the cruise air fuel and are looking for fuel mileage, which you're probably not going to do with a 65 Mustang, I would leave a carburetor on it. If the carburetor is decently tuned, and by decently tuned, I mean if you take it out of the box and put it on there, it's going to work very well. And you're not going to get a big gain in almost anything by putting those the 4-hole throttle body EFIs on there. Billy, I already talked to Eric today. Yeah, Torque-Storm went with Karen. Torque-Storm, instead of putting a bigger blower together, which they might be working on, but they just use twins on everything. How do you keep up the energy to keep this level of testing going? It's awesome stuff. I'm really excited about it, and I wish I could test more and I had more time. But the thing that I'm balancing is I don't like being away from my family. Let's see. Could you test a 671 on a matching cube motor and run it at 1-to-1? Not really positive boost, but cylinder fill and a tighter package than turbos. So you want to run a 671 supercharger on a motor that already makes enough power to negate any of the positive boost pressure? Here's the problem with that, is it's very difficult to do. It's not difficult to do at 1 RPM, but it's very difficult to do at every RPM because it's hard to match the flow rate of the blower exactly to the flow rate of the 671. That's a difficult task, actually. Calvin, you're thinking that a Torque-Storm supercharger on a 388 was running 8. Like I said, they're 700 or 750 horsepower blowers. I've run them lots and lots of times, and we know what the maximum flow rate is. Maybe I'm misreading that, but I don't think that equates to 8. More power. Torque-Storm, ProCharger, or Whipple on a new 7.3. It depends on your power needs. If you only want 700 horsepower, the Torque-Storm works good. Lots of ProChargers that are bigger than that make a lot more power, like the F1A94, make almost twice as much as power. Lots of big Whipples on there too, different boost curves. DNS production, like I said, the Torque-Storm is a 700 to 750 horsepower supercharger. So that's how much your LS3 can make with that blower. So you have to do other things to get it to make that power. But an LS3 with a cam, and you can max out that supercharger. I need a good cam for my L98. Is it an L98 tune port motor or the L98 LS? Either way, there's lots of good cams for them. Can you do a test with a 4-inch spacer under the 671 blower and also do an air-to-water cooler on it like they ran in the boats? I think Freiberger has done the intercooler under the blower. I think that they did an intercooler, and also they did the tunnel ram test, which was awesome because the tunnel ram long runners makes more power NA and makes more power with the 671. I think they also ran an intercooler test on it. Sal, my Instagram is just Richard Holdner. DNS production is 491 horsepower and 478 foot-pounds. So it's making that NA then? Yeah, 1471 is a big blower. Oh, a 91 Corvette L98, so a tune port. You're going to want a mild cam because an L98 is not going to make power at a very high RPM. So you're going to want it like a 212, 218 kind of cam. John, Rich, where would you post an LS swap car if you're selling one other than eBay or Craigslist? Appreciate. Well, go look at some of the groups that are on Facebook, and you could post it there. There's lots of selling spots for stuff on Facebook. If you don't like being away from your family, have you thought about buying a Superflow 901 absorber? Actually, the dyno is the cheap part of building a dyno. The room and everything that you need to make the dyno work is very, very expensive. And I love the guys at Westech. Greg wants to know, would a single plane style intake be a better option than a stock LS truck intake for dispersing water meth? I think that the distribution would be better on the single plane. I plan to inject it into the volute purely for detonation resistance. From your experience, what would the horsepower gains be from stroking a 454 to 496 if the heads and cam were the same? Or would the peak power be close to the same, just shifted in RPM and more area under the curve? The 496, regardless of what you choose for heads, cam, and intake, is going to make a lot more low-speed power. How much more it makes on top is going to be a function of whatever those heads and cam are. If it's stock stuff, it's obviously going to limit the 496. It'll still make a lot more power. It just won't make as much as it could if you had good heads and a good camshaft. Can you make a general estimate of horsepower per PSI on an 871 blower, 500 big block? Only if you know the NA power output, because that's what it's based on. But an 871 is, to give you an idea, on a big block, is about 1,000 to 1,100 horsepower blower, unless it's a high helix deal or it's stripped and it's a race blower. Then maybe you could go more than that, but that's really kind of where they want to be. Jay, so let's say I buy an LT4 Corvette from 96. How far can you go with stock displacement? Most guys would go with 383 on that. I think people have gone 396 maybe, but a 383 would be much more common. You can get lots of flow from an LT4 head if you port it. The intake manifold works fairly well, although it is a short runner, high RPM piece. You need to have the right camshaft in it. And then obviously long tube headers and stuff, and you can make good power. RPM air gap on a turbo 496, 429, 460, or a tall single plane. The intake manifold is not going to be determined by turbo or not turbo. It's going to be determined by what else is going on with the motor. What RPM range do you want to run the motor in? So you pick a single plane to do something different than a dual plane. If you're running to 6,000 and less, probably a dual plane. If you're running to 6,500 or 7,000, then probably the single plane. And if you're running in the middle there, you're going to have to decide how much you gain and lose. If it's a street car, I usually recommend the dual plane. Just letting you know you're about 5 minutes behind on the active chat. I know I scrolled back to get some more information. So I will scroll down and try to catch up. Let's see, L98, 350, 52 millimeter throttle wide, Edelbrock intake, Edelbrock runner, 24-pound injectors. You could get a lot from porting the head, Sal, and then a decent camshaft. But ultimately, even the Edelbrock intake, because it's a tune port deal, is going to limit where that thing makes power. Magnuson MP112 on a Gen 1 CTSV, that would be a good combination. I built rock buggies. Normally go with the Whipple, but like to build something to run street and bracket with my Sun Cool Factor Plus. Dude, you don't love the guys at West more than your wife. No, I don't. Not even close. But I have been with them for 25 years, and so I want to keep showing my support with those guys. And plus, like I said, building a dyno up here in Northern California is $100,000 or $150,000 deal. So it would be a lot. Did you ever put an M90 on a 462 valve? I have not. Yeah, Dulcich has a dyno room. I know, we could definitely have dyno parties. Yeah, James, I had put some stuff up. I've put stuff up there occasionally for sale, and I had one guy send me a message and said I had listed it for it was some part that I listed for some price, and he said, "What's the least you'll take to it? What's the least you'll take for it?" And so I messaged him back and told him $10 over what I had it listed for, and he was all confused, and then I wouldn't talk to him after that, and so he was very, very upset. Jason, hey Richard, what method of boost do you think is most reliable for a daily driver? I'm thinking about doing a single turbo 383 blow through, mild cam. I don't know which one is most reliable. The most reliable thing is a factory deal because they've put lots of time and effort into it. You can run any of those. Like I ran my Vortec for 85,000 miles on my Mustang, and so it worked all the time. You just had to make sure that the belt was tight, which we did. And then you could probably fix that with a cog belt and not have to worry about it. All of those things work well for a daily driver, and they'll all help any NA motor.
Need to build a dead reliable LS engine for endurance racing with 280 wheel horsepower and 310 foot-pounds. What are some of the mess? That sounds like a stock one. Jake, theory question: would a 1471 build boost if you put it on a small motor like a 462 valve? Yeah, it'd build too much boost would be the problem. You need a Cadillac blower. Those were hard to find after I did my first story. With my Oldsmobile 350, I personally like the Edelbrock Performer intake over the RPM. I've never run an Olds 350, so I don't know either one of those intake manifolds or how well they do. Will you do a mod video on a Dodge 4.7 HO motor? I don't have one of those. I don't even know if I've ever seen one. Do you think you can do a junkyard transmission shootout? Probably not. 4853, they handle boost well on a stock bottom end. Are the gains worth the money of running dual Torque-Storms? Well, since you can double the power output with the dual kit, if you want that much more power, you're going to have to spend that money. The other option, obviously, is to run two inexpensive GT45 turbos, which will basically get you the same thing. It'd be a lot less money. It would be different. The boost curves would be different. But they'll both make about the same amount of power. What heads do you recommend for my dad's small block 355? Flat tops, long tubes, good sounding cam, dual exhausts, performer RPM. I want your opinion. The latest Edelbrock stuff is actually pretty good. For a long time, they were kind of middle of the road, but within the last 10 years or so, they've kind of stepped their game up, and their stuff is a lot better. I usually recommend a trick flow or a airflow research head, but there are less expensive options out there now too. I've got a motor I think you might find interesting. It's called the 1UZ. I'm familiar with the Toyota motors. I've never run one because we don't have a way to hook them up on the dyno, but I do like those. Has anyone run twins on a Holley Dual Sniper? I haven't, but I think Matt is doing that. Matt from Sloppy, I think, was doing that on his. Big wheels and horsepowers in the house. Mera Barra 4.2 liters better than the Aussie Barra 4 liter. I don't know. I've been reading up a lot about the 4-liter Barra. How is the small block Magnum project going? That's the one we're going to do some testing with the 360. That's good stuff. What EGT temps would I want on a turbo application? You should pay more attention to the air fuel on the turbo application, because the EGTs can get high for a lot of different reasons that have nothing to do with, well, they do have something to do with the tune. If you take all the timing out of it, like a lot of guys run pump gas tunes on them with not very much timing, the EGTs are going to be very high on a pump gas tune. Have you ever tested power losses on different blower drives, serpentine versus cog? I haven't. That would be interesting. I think that most of the loss comes from driving the blower. So it's actually what the blower is doing, how much power consumption the blower itself has spinning the blower. I don't know if the drive assembly, if the friction from the different belts, how much they play into that. Can you test a trumpet port style lower manifold with the 289 with an M112? I don't know what trumpet port style manifold means. How many LS motors make less than 280 wheel horsepower if they have aftermarket exhaust? I think that's, I mean, that's
that's maybe a little on the high side for a stock 5.3 LM7, but and a 4.8 won't do that. But any kind of cammed motor will do that. Speedmaster versus Promax. I think I would pick. I've had really good luck with Promax stuff, and not as much on the cylinder head stuff, if that's what you're talking about, on the Speedmaster stuff. Jay wants to know how much nitrous he can run. The nitrous that you run has nothing to do with the intake manifold or the size of the motor. Well, it has something to do with the size of the motor and the cam. 410 Camaro and LQ9. We've run 300 shots on 5.3s, so you could run that as long as everything's right. A 6.0 will make more power than the 5.3, and I would do that over stroking a 5.3. Is a dry sump required? It's a good idea for a road race car. Yeah, the stock pan's not going to work. So the oiling system is really a good idea for a road race car. I know, guys. Come on. Click on that likes, yo. John's here. How do you feel about the Summit Racing 450 horsepower crated 5.3? Excuse me, I don't think I've tested one, but that power output's pretty easy to get out of a 5.3, out of a cammed 5.3. Dakota says, I'd love the video on the Pontiac 455. I'd like to see more Pontiac stuff. I would too. I tried to run the 347 Pontiac, the 57 that I have, but we didn't have a bell housing for it. Summit Stage 3 cam is basically for LSX cam. What I can say about the nitrous is the more power that you make NA, the more nitrous you can hit it with. So if you have a 200 horsepower motor, it's very hard to hit it with 500 horsepower with a nitrous. If you have a 1,000 horsepower motor, you can probably hit it with 500 horsepower with a nitrous. So the amount of nitrous that the motor can process is a function of its own naturally aspirated power output. What sort of difference would there be in a 454 LS versus a 454 big block, assuming they have similar flowing heads and similar cams? I don't know. Maybe there would be none. If they have the same static compression, the same head flow, the same intake manifold, that's one area where the LS would probably be better. The LS also normally has a windage tray and stuff. So when we did the small block test, the LS is definitely better. And I think we might see that with the big block too. So you want a bell mouth on the runners for a lower manifold for an M112. Here's the thing with the blower manifold. Most blower manifolds are a big common plenum, and sometimes they have a little bit of runner sticking off the part that's attached to the head. Sometimes it's just an opening into the head. And they're usually, when they design them right, they usually have some kind of radius going into the head. So what they have is no runner length. If you put a bell mouth on it and add runner length, that would be beneficial. The problem is if you go from no runner length or from 1 inch or 2 inches to 3 inches or 4 inches, you're still talking about an intake manifold that's optimized for power production at 9,000 RPM. So it doesn't do a great deal on a blower application in the RPM range where we normally run it. You have to make a big change. Like, for instance, I did a test with the 464 valve, and what the guys from Vortec did was they did what everybody else did on the 03 Cobra motor, is they got rid of the blower, but made a manifold that used the factory air-to-water intercooler.
but it was just a big open plenum basically, and they put that on top of the factory lower manifold where the intercooler sits, and so it had no runner length, so it didn't do very well. It made power, and it had a good intercooler, or it had a factory intercooler, and then we took that off and put a factory 2001 long runner Cobra manifold, and it just made more power. It made more power everywhere. All the way up to the top of the RPM range. I think we went to 7,000 or something on the test. I'd have to look to verify to make sure that I know that it made more power basically everywhere. And then if you have the blower and an external intercooler and a long runner intake manifold, it's going to do better because they like runners. Even on a roots blower, they like runners. That's why when Freiberger did the big block test, they ran the standard no runner, open plenum root style intake manifold, and then put a tunnel ram on it and ran the same roots blower on that. And then the tunnel ram makes more power NA, and it makes more power when you put the blower on it compared to the stock one because it has runner length. Yes, I would like to. You want my email address? Let's see. It is killerb16. What horsepower do you think you might make with a boosted Magnum? I don't know what the boosted power will be because I have no idea what the NA power is. Yes, I talked to Eric already about the intake manifold. Sorry I was late. I was knee deep in being awesome. Very good. Very good. Well played, sir. Way off topic, but what are your thoughts on the LTG 2-liter turbo engine out of the Cadillac, ATS, and Camaros? Those are cool. I've never tested one, but every turbo motor is great. Any plans on testing a D16 or 15 motor, Big Bang style? I know I've never run a single cam. I mean, we've done lots of single cam turbo stuff way back in the day when Ernie was back at West Tech, and before that with the guys at Powertrain too. And I think that the most we ever ran was 350 or 400 horsepower at the tire on a D series. Never as much as it would do. Yep, Brenda, I talked to Eric today. Rex, what's up? LBA, I have an 84 Pontiac Trans Am that has a 400 swapped into it. Nice. I'm not sure what the engine is. I believe it was built a long time ago. What would you do with a 400 to make a fun, ratty muscle car? Well, it's the same thing as every other small block. It just needs good heads, a good intake manifold, and a good camshaft, and then away you go. I've got 350 with 441 heads. You know anything about those heads? Yeah, the 441 heads are fairly good for a factory head. They're not as good as a set of Vortec heads or as good as any of the aftermarket heads, but they'll make power. They probably flow 200 CFM or so. If the airfill ratio is good but EGTs are high, does that mean I have high back pressure? It could normally mean also that you have low timing. What fuel regulator for twin 044 on LS53 turbo hexagonal? I don't know what that is. But any adjustable fuel pressure regulator will work, or we use the factory one also. Yep, I got the email about Eric and the intake testing. The Squirrel, an engine tuner, but real sloppy. Can a stock Gen 4 5.3 live reliable with a blower cam 671 running 8 PSI in the street? Yes, it can easily. I mean, given what we do with the turbo stuff, that's fairly easy. And what you should do is put a good size cam in it. And don't worry about the boost number, just worry about the power number. Can you do a shootout between a turbo Pinto 2.3 versus the EcoBoost 2.3 and compile a simple mods list to make power match the stock EcoBoost? I think actually it would take a lot for that early 2.3 to match what a EcoBoost 2.3 was. Isn't the EcoBoost a 4-valve motor? Yeah, the screen freezes from time to time. Any chance for a Big Bang 4.2 liter? Yeah, we might do that. 10-to-1 compression with turbo, 585 lift, 234, 243. Let's see. Dynamic compression, no timing, broke my pistons. Well, something was wrong. I mean, it's obviously you had detonation, so you had too much timing or not enough fuel. So one of those things happened. I've seen both the videos where you like the BTR cam and the sloppy cam. I don't like and recommend camshafts typically, so that's misleading. I show you what the cams do, and then you get to pick them. That's why I give you the graph, so you can say, hey, look, I want that power curve. And then when I tested it, here's what that cam does. So if you like that cam and want that power curve, then you pick that camshaft. It's very easy. Has anyone here heard of Phytech EFI? Yes, we all have heard of Phytech. Ever messed with a V8 outboard 2-stroke modified for use in a car? No, that sounds pretty cool, though. We have run the EcoBoost 3.5 liter V6s, not on the engine dyno, but on the chassis dyno. Those things were impressive. Your thoughts on higher boost applications on race gas versus just lowering the timing for pump gas? Well, if you're going to lower the timing, you're going to make a lot less power. And as you go up in boost with pump gas, you're going to increase your chance of detonation. Some say to lower the boost and raise the timing. I don't know if you're talking about the same thing. For high boost levels, we run race gas or E85 and intercooling. I usually don't run high boost stuff with pump gas. What's the best cam for an L31 350? Depends on what you're trying to do. If you want to make 600 horsepower, that cam is going to be different than a camshaft that you want to make, say, 400 horsepower with or 350 horsepower with. What happened to 3800 SC Big Bang? We're still working on it. We're still working on getting the motor running. Would a warmed over LS engine brutally stomp the brains out of an apples to apples small block Chevy? You can make lots of power out of a small block Chevy, and you can make lots of power out of an LS. So I'm not sure why one of them has to be better than the other. Boosted 2-stroke diesel V8. Turbo Dave, I'm running a 6.2 Hellcat long block with an 88 millimeter precision and a stock 5.7 truck intake. Do you have the Hellcat? Do you have a camshaft in that? I'm hoping. And I think that the late model truck intake, if it will fit on those heads, is probably better, the dual runner one. Oh, use Phytech. We've run a couple of them, or they have run a couple of them at West Tech. I don't think I ever have. Ever heard of anyone slapping a 2650 rotor pack onto an old school block? Well, you should be able to run a 2650 blower on anything with the right adapter, right? Are Predator carburetors a relic of the past, worth finding for daily driving with a bit of nostalgia? Thomas, they look really cool. And so if you want to have one and want to be different, then I would say yes. I don't think that you're going to find that they do anything extremely better than putting a Holly on it, or a Quadrajet or Thermoquad or whatever carburetor you like and can tune. I don't know that you'll find anything, especially for a daily driver, other than it being cool and awesome and nobody else is going to have one. 93 octane, 18 pounds, 18 okay to run for 750 horsepower. I don't know about the 93 octane. Does a centrifugal supercharger have the same parasitic loss as a roots blower? No, it doesn't. The roots blower is much higher. Is there a difference between picking cam for a manual car versus automatic? For some people, there is, only because they don't want a very high idle, which sometimes you have to have with a bigger camshaft. With a manual trans, that's okay. But in an automatic, when you go from park and put it in gear, they don't want it to clunk because of the high idle. So a lot of guys want a camshaft that will idle low enough so that when they put it in gear, it doesn't do that. Also, sometimes you have to, if you put a big camshaft in it, change the converter so that it works better. So those are all things to consider when picking your camshaft. I'm planning on running the Mellings 2280 cam on my L31. I'm not familiar with the Melling stuff. Let's see, what kind of power supporting mods is good? Is this good for? LT4 reported everything. I would need to know the duration at 50 on that camshaft. And how well the heads are ported, because if I ported a set of heads, they're not probably going to be better than stock. It might be worse. If a real guy ports them, then you can make a lot of power. But those heads, if they're properly ported, can easily support 550 and maybe as much as 600 horsepower. I'd like to see Holly carbs versus the new Holly Sniper Stealth. Like I said, if it's a daily driver and you're trying to get real good fuel mileage, which is where EFI comes in. If it's not that and you're putting lots of miles on it where you can basically pay for the conversion to EFI, I would run a carburetor on it. I would run a carburetor on any kind of old school small block. Yeah, if you had dual Predator carbs, it's even better. Then it would be like Bigfoot. How does the power robbed from the turbo back pressure compare to the horsepower needed to spin the blower? It's not even close. There's very little power caused by the back pressure of the turbo, and lots of power consumed by trying to spin a supercharger. Like I said, on some of these blowers, you can have 100, 200, even 300 horsepower required to drive, for instance, a 2650 blower at its maximum blower speed, boost, and flow rate. It could be 300 horsepower to drive that blower. So that's a lot. You'll never have 300 horsepower with the losses or anywhere near that on a turbo. I sent a message, Mark. I sent a message to Jeremy. I haven't heard back from him. AFR 195 eliminators are very good. So Brenda, let me clarify. Steve Morse took one of his motors and ran it on high octane and then ran it on pump gas. Same boost. He just lowered the timing on pump gas. Well, how high was that boost? Like if you ran it at 10 pounds, you can run that on pump gas. But if you're running 30 or 40 pounds, then you can't just lower the timing, because I don't think you could take away enough timing to make that work. There are boost levels where that can happen. And obviously Steve knows what he's doing. I mean, he's the guy. And you can run any amount of boost that you want on pump gas, and I salute you and wish you well. I don't do it. I don't run high boost on pump gas and take timing away, because then the other problem that you have is if you run that for any length of time with limited timing, you have very, very high EGTs, which is also not a good thing. So if you run it sustained like that with very high EGTs, your chances of detonation go up, and your chance of ruining exhaust valves and all kinds of things can happen. That's why I don't like running pump gas on high boost level stuff. All the 6-cylinder action. When is the Monster LV3? I don't have one, nor have I even looked at one, but I have talked to Brian Tooley about testing one. Forgot to say thank you for stories on your vids. 27 years of GN parts and chew GNs must go. Tons of memories of GN versus 5 years. Yeah, that was back in the day. Do you know anything about Flowtech heads? I don't know that I've tested those. Any advantage to the LH6 aluminum block over an iron block for high horsepower turbo applications? I don't think there's an advantage other than it weighs less. So that in itself would help it go, help your car accelerate if it weighs less. But lots of guys running those aluminum blocks at very, very high boost levels, and also running the iron ones at very, very high boost levels. What are your thoughts on meth versus E85? I don't think you can make the power on water meth injection that you can make on E85. And I worry about distribution on the E85 on intake manifolds. So that's my concern with that. Why don't you ever test any Texas speed cams? I have run Texas speed cams in the past, and I would run more of them if they wanted to work with me. Oh, John, a root style supercharger is the most inefficient style of charge airing unless you're talking about awesomeness power. That's a different story. Agreed, that is. And that's why you do it. Like I said, if it sticks out of the hood and looks awesome and that's what you're trying to do and has that blower whine and, it has the Road Warrior kind of look, and that is nothing but cool. Let's see. When are we going to test the 429 and the T-Bird you talked about a year ago? I'm patiently waiting. That's my buddy Mark Sanchez's motor. I need to test it. A centrifugal supercharger is much more efficient than a root style supercharger. Fact. I like when they put that in there, like, because we didn't just put the stamp on it. Will Brian Tooley Racing spec cams for other brand motors? I don't know. If you brought him a Toyota or something, I don't think that he would do that. When it comes to custom ground cams, does it make a difference what manufacturer you buy from? I think that it does. I think that you need to get people that understand when they're designing cams what you're designing them for, and not just how they make power, because lots of guys can put aggressive ramp rates in them and make power, but they also don't last very long. So if you have a camshaft that makes 5 or 10 extra horsepower, but lasts for 5,000 miles, that's not really a good trade-off. I'd rather trade the 5 horsepower or to even 10 horsepower and make sure that the cam lasts. It doesn't beat up the rockers or the valve tips or knock the lifters out of it. Is there any point, excuse the pun, to switching from a points distributor, HEI, or magnetic pickup? The only advantage I could see, since a lot of people don't understand, they think that points don't have enough energy to do this, but it's just a triggering mechanism. So the energy that you send to the plugs is going to be a function of coil energy. The thing that I don't like about points, and the reason why the OEMs or hardly anybody uses them anymore, is because they wear out, so that they're not the same all the time. Whereas most electronic ignitions don't wear out. I mean, you have the cap and the rotor part, and that wears out in a points distributor too. But the triggering mechanism, the points themselves wear out. So the gap becomes bigger as they erode, and so it doesn't fire nearly as effectively. And you have to keep, and I say keep, I mean every 10,000 or 15,000 or 20,000 or whatever the interval is, you have to keep replacing them or adjusting them. So that would be something that might be a reason why you wouldn't want them. Have you really come that far when the early 60s cars were making 420 horsepower from the factory? We have 800 horsepower cars now that are making a real 800 horsepower. Because if you race a 400 horsepower car from the 60s compared to a 400 horsepower car now, it wouldn't even be close. Would you suggest a different cam for halidation? I wouldn't, actually. I would just pick the cam that made the power curve that I wanted, and you're going to lose power at elevation with any sort of camshaft. If I was going to do anything, maybe I would tighten the LSA up a little bit, but you might try to do that anyway. The turbo TPI is talking about an L67 3800 guy that went from an M90 to an Eaton to a turbo, and the turbo made huge gains over the blower at the same boost numbers. I would expect that. I mean, if you look at all the testing that we do, the turbo makes more power at the same boost because it doesn't have to drive the blower. And those gains become higher and higher. The gains offered by the turbo become higher and higher compared to a roots blower as you go up in boost, because the M90 gets less and less efficient and requires more and more parasitic loss to drive the blower. So it's going bad in both directions compared to a turbo. Have you ever tested an LS7 454 from 1970? No, but that's one of my favorite cars. Mine would be the LS6 454 from the 1970 Chevelle, because they didn't put the LS7 in any factory car. That was actually a crate motor. That was a serious motor, though. It was basically a 454 version of like an L88, 12.5-to-1, big mechanical cam, aluminum heads. It was a serious deal, but again, it's not a factory motor and wasn't ever put in anything. So it would be more like a 1970s crate motor that they had back from GM. what I've wanted to do for a long time is build a reproduction of a couple of big blocks from back in the day. So it'd be cool to have a stage 1 455, which probably could be done and done fairly inexpensively. I'd like to build an LS6 or an L88 would be awesome, or even an L72 or an L89 would be cool. It's just hard finding those parts. You know, nobody's going to let me take their L88 and run it on the dyno probably. And it's hard to even get the parts to build those motors because those, like a set of L88 heads is a big dollar thing anymore. And so is the original carburetor and the original intake and yada, yada, yada. And so making it all work is a difficult proposition. I'd like to do it because I would like to show what they did compared to the stuff that we run now, because I like all of that stuff. I know someone with 3 old ZL1s. Those would be awesome to run too. Have you had any experience with C&D rotor screw blowers? I have not. I've never heard of them. I've done lots with twin screw blowers, Whipples and Kenny Bells, and the old auto rotor stuff way back in the Sprintex and stuff, but way back in the day. But I've not heard that name before. If you run a factory crate engine, a 427 sock motor, yeah, that'd be easy to come by. Just scrolling back to see somebody was made a comment. I have a friend here in Rio Oso that has a brand new LS7 1974 54 sold in a crate. Nice. Hard to get gas for those. Those are real high compression deals. What's the most power you've made with a 671? With a 671 from the blower shop, we made close to 1,000 horsepower, and it was on a I can't remember if it was on the 540 crate motor from Blueprint or the 496, but that's about what I think that's about what that blower would do. No, the old school 60s and 70s stuff had bias ply tires. It was hard for them to put power down. Yeah, W30 Oldsmobile, good. Another 455 would be good. Come to Florida. I'll be happy to let you figure out the right turbo or supercharger for my 390 FE. That would be pretty easy to do. Just tell me what the power output is now and what power output you want. Ever messed with the VR6 VW? I have not. I think that it probably is worth spending money if you're going to do upgraded pistons and rods on a 544 valve, because if you have a rod knock now, more than likely you've got a bad rod and or crank. Call John Causey for a 427 single overhead cam motor. Now, John might have somebody that where we could run a stock one. I should call John and ask him. He might actually know about that. How about the big Whipple power number as a 5.0? Those will make a lot of power. I think Rick from West Tech has I think he has L88 heads, and he's got a couple of Corvettes, I think, and I think one of them was an L72 Corvette too. I've never tested an 8.1 LS. And the 8.1 is actually a big block. It's not an LS. It's a Gen 7 big block engine family. If you had the machining capability, would you ever be tempted to try and put a ProCharger style drive on something like a Paxton blower? Why would you want to combine those two when the ProCharger is already a centrifugal blower like the Paxton? I don't understand what you would gain from that. How much more RPM do you think you get out of grinding and polishing the sides of a set of rods? I don't think any. I think all that they did that for was to make themselves feel better and to reduce the chance of the initiation point of cracks, basically. But I don't know that that helped a great deal. I know that used to be the thing back in the day. LT1 pink rods, and they were polished beams. I have a 2008 Pontiac G8, which I have to get going, and just this will be my last question. I have a 2008 Pontiac G8 GT, and I'm debating between Torque-Storm and LSA Supercharger. Is Torque-Storm really worth the buy versus just going with an LSA? An LSA probably can get you more power than the Torque-Storm can. Also, it's going to have more average power because it's going to have power down low, immediate boost response that the Torque-Storm is not going to have. So that's something to think about. Thank you guys for all for showing up. I've got to get back to editing so I can get this other blower story up. 671 versus a Torque-Storm Supercharger on a small block Chevy. If you have not, make sure you go look at the everybody go watch the modular Ford one. For some reason, the 2-valve modular stuff just doesn't get the love that everything else does. But thanks everybody for showing up. I will see you later.